One of the things that struck me about convention, reminded me about Lutherans at convention, is that Lutherans just can't stop talking about theology, no matter what we do. And we'd like to talk about good theology, and by good theology I mean a way of talking about God and God's activity in the world that is deeply influenced by the political and social battles of the 16th century. Good theology is what defines us as Lutherans. It's unique to us. Anglicans, on the other hand, are defined by a certain prescribed way of worshiping. The Latin term is lex orandi, lex credendi. The law of prayer is the law of belief. Anglicans don't know what they believe until they pray it. It's what binds them together. The Roman Catholic Church has the Pope as a unifying figure, for better or for worse. No matter where you are in the world, no matter what your theological beliefs, no matter what your style of worship you have, it's the Pope, or the Vicar of Christ on earth they call him, who stands at the center of their faith. But we Lutherans don't have it so easy. As Lutherans, we say that it's the doctrine of justification by grace through faith that brings us together. Justification by faith, as those remember from confirmation class, is the notion that we sinful human beings are brought into a right relationship with God, not through any actions or inactions on our part, but because we are declared innocent and clean because of Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection to new and everlasting life. We are saved by grace through faith and not by works of the law, as we heard in today's reading from Galatians. That's Lutheranism's central defining idea. The problem then lies when we try to figure out what all this means. How does such a notion help us to understand the Bible? No two Lutherans agree on that. How does such an idea help us with faithful daily living? Lutherans are still fighting over that question. How does the doctrine of justification by grace through faith help us to relate to an unbelieving world? Lutherans are still squabbling over what that means. Lutherans fight because Lutherans like to be right. We like to have our theology all wrapped up tightly in a box so no air can get out. We don't like our theology to breathe. We don't like it to have life. In fact, when the Lutheran confessions were written, the Lutheran confessions being a body of writing that tries to sort out exactly what we believe, it's a confession not in the confessing our sins sort of way, but in confessing what we believe sort of way. When the Lutheran confessions were written, Martin Luther and the other writers went to great pains to demonstrate that they weren't saying anything new, that the emerging Lutheran movement was steeped in old, traditional thinking, that it was their way of telling their enemies that they had plugged all the theological holes so nothing new could get in and nothing old could escape. And so we equate proper believing with having good theology. For Lutherans, faithfulness seems to begin and end right here in our brains, in how we think about God. For Lutherans, the tendency is to put more value on the content of our belief than in seeing God's work in people's lives. And today's gospel reading is a direct challenge to those of us who equate correct theological thinking with faithful Christian practice. The story says, "Then they arrived at the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. As Jesus stepped out on land, a man of the city who had demons met him. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he did not live in the house but in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he fell down before him and shouted at the top of his voice, 'What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me.'" You have to look for it. But once you see it, you can't take your eyes off it. When the demon-possessed man saw Jesus, he fell down before him and shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." He calls him Jesus, Son of the Most High God. This is the first time and the only time in Luke's Gospel where Jesus was addressed by his proper, royal, divine title. Son of the Most High God. And he was called this not by the disciples who had been learning at his feet. They didn't really have a clue who Jesus was. The disciples argued with each other about who he was. And it was certainly not the religious leaders, many of whom were more interested in protecting their power in society than guiding people in the way of God. It was the demons possessing this man who knew who Jesus was. It was the forces of those who would thwart God's mission, who called Jesus by his correct title and showed him proper respect. It was the enemies of God's kingdom who had the best theology. And as a Lutheran, I find that a challenge to everything I've been taught. While on the surface I've been taught that the doctrine of justification by faith and not by works of the law has been central to our faith. But it really, underneath that, suggests that I'm really saved by my belief in this doctrine. If these demons can believe and confess better theology than I can, where does that leave me? Where does that leave you? It may be not good theology that you hope saves you. It may be your faith in your own personal moral code. It may be your life of worship and prayer, or how many Bible verses you know. It may be your work ethic. It may be financial success. It may be all those hours volunteering. But we know that there's nothing wrong with any of these. But we also know that there's always someone who is better than us in what we strive for, better than us in what we think brings us value. There's always someone who prays longer and better than we do. There's always someone who is richer, who works harder, who has more integrity, who spends more time giving to others. There's always someone we think is farther ahead in the Christian path. So what happens then? What happens when we know we've fallen short of our own human standards, much less than God's? What happens when we are confronted with the fact that we will never be as good as we want to be? I guess that leaves us where we usually are, as sinners in need of God's grace, as people whose hope is in the one who died and rose again for us, people who have been washed clean in the waters of baptism, who have been liberated of the legions within that keep us far from God, who have been forgiven and set free. People who have been told by Jesus, return to your home and declare how much God has done for you. And may this be so among us. Amen.